Women make up more than half of the church, and yet most churches have leadership structures that are predominantly male driven. It's easy to see how there might be some blind spots of things that people at the top levels either don't see or misunderstand about what helps women to grow spiritually. So I'm excited today to be able to have a conversation with Dr. Anessa Westbrook about women's spirituality and spiritual growth. Dr. Westbrook is an assistant professor in the College of Bible and Ministry at Harding University. She has an extensive education. She did her undergraduate studies in psychology. She has a master's degree in church growth, as well as a certificate in women's ministry from the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. She earned her Master of Divinity degree from Harding University School of Theology in Memphis. But then she also completed her Doctor of Ministry degree at the Fuller Theological Seminary, where she spent time especially studying the ways that young women grow spiritually and some of the things that help them to do this. Today, she's going to share insights from what she's learned. Anessa, thank you very much for making time to have this conversation with me today.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I really appreciate a lot of your hard work on the subject of women's spirituality and spiritual growth, and so I'm excited to hear what you can teach us about this. Why don't you talk a little bit about what has made you feel so driven towards this subject, where you've really seen a need?
Well, I think that really started back in college. So when I was in college, especially my freshman year, I started to think about where I could fit into the kingdom. And I started down this path of exploration, just praying about what that might look like. And in that process, I found it a little bit difficult to find people to mentor me as a female. And there were lots of great mentors, and we were just blessed and surrounded by that. But just as a woman, what would that look like? And specifically, I started exploring mission work. So that kind of led me down this path, realizing that there was definitely a need for females to, really speak into each other's lives. So fast forward, went to the mission field, was trying to kind of figure out where I fit in, what I could do. And when we came back from the mission field 8 years later, God just put it on my heart to minister to women. Mm-hmm. And that was something that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't something that I had really spent a lot of time thinking about, but my heart just broke for women, really. And so I just praying about it, thinking about it, didn't know what could be done at that time. I had already had a master's degree at that point just because I love learning. It was just kind of continuing education for me. But as the kids were starting to enter into kindergarten, I was praying more about what I could do, and this whole idea of going into it more on a professional basis came about. Mm-hmm. So, and I just wanted to do something to help women grow spiritually. So that's really, from a personal standpoint, that's what got me started.
Yeah. It was interesting to me looking over your educational credentials, how, you do enjoy learning, but I could kind of see over time that's always been like an ongoing little pulse that was there. And so It's neat that you've been able to find some opportunities to explore it more, and then also with your current role at Harding to be able to really engage some of the ideas that you've been sharing. So I guess we can talk a little bit more about that later. So in thinking about women's spirituality, what it is that would really help women, especially young women, to grow, there are probably some blind spots that we have. There are probably some assumptions that we make that may not be good assumptions. What would be some normal assumptions you think that people might have that need some challenging?
Well, just starting at a junior high or high school level, just thinking of the local church, I think there's a lot of emphasis on raising male spiritual leaders, and that's great. That's really important. But I think in the process of focusing on that, because it is a hard thing to do, to raise male spiritual leaders, but focusing on that, sometimes I think the women are forgotten. So where do they fit in? How can they serve? And so I think more emphasis needs to be put on helping the women, the young women in the churches as well. So I think that's one thing. I do believe in some cases that is very unintentional, but women need a chance to grow too.
Yeah.
And young women need a chance to have those experiences. So I think my research does help in this area too, kind of pointing out some areas where they might be able to find some areas for growth. So,
So even in churches where women are less likely to have publicly visible roles, there's still absolutely a need for the role models and the mentoring and possibly some further expansion in what we do publicly to acknowledge and celebrate the good work that our women are doing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the shape of your research that you did for Fuller. I know you were able to do it there at Harding University. So why don't you talk a little bit about the shape of your research and what it was that you did as you conducted it?
Well, I was curious to see what was actually helping people grow spiritually. We talk about that a lot. So, what can we do to help our students grow spiritually? But we've never actually tested it or looked at it. And so that was kind of part of it because I felt like a lot of our conversations were perhaps not unfounded, but maybe unsupported. We're just guessing.
Right.
And so I wanted to look at that. But specifically, I wanted to see what helped women grow spiritually. Now I've got data on men too, because I wanted to be able to compare, but that was basically what I was thinking when I chose.
So when you did your research, you really were researching both young men and young women. I think it was a little over 600 people that you took surveys of in the sophomore class, and so really you've got data on both, but it was the women especially that you were kind of focusing in on making some application from.
Yes. Yeah. But I did get good advice to get both.
So looking at what you discovered from talking to a lot of young women, and again, it's fascinating how some of these things that we all acknowledge as really important, like we should really care about spiritual growth. And you're right. I think it's the community there to talk about, well, we need to make sure our people are growing spiritually, but fascinating to think about how seldom perhaps we actually pull back and do empirical research on what accomplishes that. Yeah. So when you look at some of the things that you found, what would you describe as some points of application? What are some things that you see that would need to be different?
Well, one of the things, and I'm kind of calling this a shadow. So I'm deep into the numbers. I'm looking at them and I'm trying to figure out exactly what they mean. And that is that some of the most typical avenues of development seem to be more open to and I better talk about the students since the research was on the students, but it seems to be more open to the male students rather than the female students.
Sure.
So that was one thing. So I discovered that male students, so women, so I was kind of trying to look to see what they thought would be the most beneficial avenue for them. So women would want to be mentored.
Yeah.
But then at the end of the day, when the student was looking back on their experiences, the male students seemed to receive more from mentoring than the women. And then there were some women who never had anybody really try to help them grow spiritually. So I'm kind of calling that there seems to be a shadow. So there seems to be a lack there where women want mentoring, but then at the same time, they're not receiving the mentoring. So that was one big thing. The other thing is that what we typically put a lot of time and effort into may not be as effective as we think. And so students, not surprisingly, they are more experiential. The world is becoming more experiential. And women especially are more experiential, which is somewhat problematic because if women grow best spiritually by doing, and then they don't know how to do, then that has a really great effect on their spiritual growth because they need to be plugged in and they need to be involved. And they also, this is another, I think, very big, important piece, which you can probably see this in the frustration of different people that you've talked to, women that have tried to enter into ministry. But women are different from men in that they need early affirmation to be able to develop an idea of what they can do in church. And so they need somebody to say, you would be good at this. You should do this. You should pursue this. And when that happens, then spiritual growth occurs. Now, for men, it's often the other way around. That's more of a result of it. They do something and they do a good job, and then somebody speaks into them and affirms them.
Yeah.
And that is just an affirmation of what they've already been doing.
Mhm.
But because women can't imagine what they can do in our movement, that's especially complicated because
Mhm.
they often don't know what they can do,
Mhm.
and they need that affirmation to be able to figure that out.
Fascinating. So you're kind of saying, I mean, there's really several gaps in this. I mean, to begin with,
Right.
it's like you say, kind of
Yeah.
a shadow, kind of a blind spot. Are we
Hmm.
even talking about how it is we're going to grow our young women? And
Hmm.
then you say that the young men, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's almost like the young men are a little better, perhaps, at being like the self-starters. And again, there's a lot of environment that encourages young men to do this stuff anyways. But so a young man will try something and get affirmed. But you're saying something that's really crucial for females is that they need the affirmation before they've even tried it. You know, they really need
Right.
affirmation to
Yes.
even take that step. And
Right.
yeah,
Mhm.
fascinating too to think about. Um, how do you imagine yourself doing something that you haven't seen done before? Um,
That is very difficult. And that was
yeah.
my struggle, is because I wanted to be an active missionary. Not to say there was never an active missionary before me, but just as far as what was in my immediate circle, what could a woman do on the mission field? I wanted to be able to imagine what that looked like.
Hmm.
And even here, I wanted to be able to imagine what I could do. But when you don't have a lot of, patterns out there and a lot of women who can show you, it does make it much more difficult.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Fascinating. Challenging.
yeah.
So, talk a little more about some of the things that you found. What would be some things that you see a real need for? What needs to be different?
Well, I think churches need to consider where they're putting their money. And this is a really, really touchy topic
Okay.
because we put a lot of focus into certain things. Like, for example, a lot of our focus goes into 2 hours or 3 hours Sunday morning.
Hmm.
And from a theological standpoint, that concerns me just a little bit because we're putting the focus, so it's kind of like we're sending an unintentional message that this is what being a Christian is about.
Hmm.
What happens between 10 a.m. and noon on Sunday. And that's real limiting when we look at it from a bigger perspective. Do we really want the people in our churches to think that being a Christian is just going and showing up and worshiping well for 2 hours a week? Or should we look at that from a broader standpoint? And how this goes in with this whole question of, where do women fit into the church? So, in churches where they cannot participate actively during this period of time, then that's a huge frustration. I mean, if that's the goal
Hmm.
of being a Christian, is being able to be a leader during those couple of hours a week, then what are they supposed to do? And if we look at the Gospels and we look at Jesus's example, he's ministering all the time. And
Yeah.
so if we would broaden our concept of what church is and what ministry is, then I really feel like it would help women.
Hmm.
So if there's one change I could make in the way we do church, it would be this, is to really broaden our understanding, broaden our concept of what doing church is. It's living our lives.
Mm.
That's our mission. And when we look at it from a broader perspective, that opens up more opportunities for leadership development and for service. And that's good for both genders
Right.
because some men, they're not even comfortable being in a public setting, showing leadership in a public setting. So that's really good for the church, and I think it's really good for all members.
Yeah. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, there was some pretty sobering findings you had when you were asking questions about like the places where young people actually experience spiritual growth. Could you talk a little bit about
Yes.
that? Because I know I was
Yes.
looking at things like worship services, and as you're talking about, we need to place more emphasis on the other parts of what's going on for Christians during the week. But I know you had some numbers that were pretty hard to hear about the way young people feel about what they're actually getting out of the typical ways we
Definitely.
go about shaping people.
Definitely. Well, just to share some of these numbers. So, one of my questions was which activity facilitated the most spiritual growth before college?
Hmm.
And here's the response. So, for men, okay, so this total percentage, they're picking one just to make sure the numbers are
Hmm.
understood. Only 6.2% chose worship service. And again, thinking about all the effort and all the
Hmm.
time, that's put into that. For women, it's 3.7%.
Wow. So about half of what women, men have a really
Yeah.
low percentage in terms of young men and what they feel like they're getting from just the worship experience. And you're saying that for young women, it's considerably lower.
It's even lower. Yeah.
Wow.
I felt like that was pretty sobering. I didn't expect that.
No.
I honestly did not know what the findings were going to reveal. There were a couple of things that I was trying to reproduce something else, but this one, no, I wasn't expecting this at all. So church Bible class, 5.1%. That's for men. For women, it's 2.9%. So again, very low. For school Bible classes, that may not be as relevant to this. It was pretty low. It was 1.2%, 1.1, but I don't know what the percentage was that attended a private Christian school.
Right.
Now, the things that were the most, and this was interesting, and I feel like this is something that could affect church budgeting, but church camp. So men chose it at 36.2%, and women chose it at 35%.
Wow.
So that's extremely high. That's also very experiential.
Right.
And so they're going to be able to go there, get away from the temptations of phones, and really have an experience it. And that really ties in well with some other findings I had. So when I see a number like this, so 36%, 35%, churches really need to consider, should we put more emphasis on church camp? Because, I mean, church camp can be very expensive for some families. So is that something we need to shift some funds for, need to emphasize some more? So another one was mission trips. And so for men, it was 18.7% that chose a mission trip or mission trips. And then for women, 19.8%. So again, very high. And just to kind of put that in perspective, I mean, that's basically 5 times. For women, they're picking a mission trip at 5 times the rate that they did worship service.
Wow.
And so again, going back into the experiential and where do I fit in, you look at missions, and typically that's been an area where women have been able to find a place to serve easier. I mean, that just ties in with that too. So
yeah, that's captivating to think about. And it's also making me think about, church camp, mission trips, highly relational places that kind of get us out of the norm, let us connect more deeply. So those would be 2 big, obvious, easy things that churches could consider deeper involvement in. It would seem to me that perhaps there's also some space, based on what you're saying, even to think about more little things sprinkled along the way. I know when I was in youth ministry, I believed that church camp, mission trip, and then also I always did a fall retreat and a spring retreat, and felt like those, you could just see a conspicuous change in the students after that one little weekend, and the way that could even last for months in terms of its positive effect.
Oh, yeah, sure. And I didn't even put a retreat on here. I did devotionals. That ranked high as well. For men, it was 8.9%. And then for the female students, it was 12.6% that chose it. So, and personal Bible study ranked at about twice the rate as worship service. So that's good, you know. But, so very experiential.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So if we're going to be serious about, and obviously a lot of the stuff we're doing, we're thinking about both genders, but it is fascinating that there's a strong correlation for both genders with the outside experiential stuff being more formative than just, the regular, like you say, kind of the 2-hour block on Sunday mornings. This would also make me think about a lot of families who kind of tell themselves, well, we make it to class when we can, but as long as I get my kids to worship most of the time, that's probably good enough, right? I think your research would say it's not.
No, it's not. It's not. They need to have heavier engagement with church. Now, here's something else that I found to be interesting. When we're looking at men and women, so comparing the students, the women seem to appreciate local church at a higher rate than men, which is interesting.
It is.
Given the fact that the local church seems to be pouring more into the male students. But the female students, I mean, they're finding their way. They're finding, ways to get involved, but they don't really know where they fit in. And so I think that's also something important to keep in mind. Yeah,
because they do value local churches, and so
yes, they
relationships
do.
and connections are important. But there's got to be some other facets of church life we could be thinking about that would benefit them. So
right.
Why don't you talk a little bit about? Are there some examples you could point to now of churches where you've seen this kind of thing handled well? Like, have you been able to discover some places where you've said, "Hey, this church is starting to get it," or here are some things that other churches could be imitating?
That's a very difficult question
Okay.
because I don't know about all the churches and what they're doing, but I often don't see great examples, specific examples of that. One trend that I do think is helpful is that there are more and more churches that are looking for female youth interns.
Yeah.
And so when you can get a female youth intern in, then that's something that's good because you're providing an example of how to engage in ministry and what to do. And let me just kind of place this little caveat with it, though. She needs to be allowed to do something active.
Right.
So I have seen cases where the church hired a female intern and then really didn't empower her to do anything. And so that's a little frustrating. And I think that could be discouraging for the younger students when they see that. But I do think that that's a good trend. I've definitely seen an uptick in that in the last few years. So that's helpful. I also think that doing that is just good in an age of Me Too. So that is a huge issue. We're seeing a lot of people that have gone through all kinds of different assaults. And spiritually, that is a very difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah.
And so having a female intern or a female youth minister really puts somebody in place that's going to be able to help these girls as they're trying to deal with some of that. So
Yeah, that's significant. You're right. There are certain things that it really is easier to talk to someone of your own gender. It'd be very difficult to talk to as a female. I can only imagine how hard it would be to talk to a male about some of those kinds of things.
Yeah, and that conversation may not even happen. It just depends on the relationship. So yeah.
So another thing, I know when I was looking at some of your findings, you were talking about the importance of positive role models and mentoring. And, we've already talked about that some, about how women really need people to come alongside them and to disciple them and to believe in them. So now I know I'm thinking about you personally, but as you've taken on this role at Harding, I'm sure you're probably trying to embody some of these things that you see as important. So could you talk a little bit about what you think it could look like for Christians to do more mentoring? What would that process look like? If someone like you were to go and say, well, hey, I need to take it on myself to mentor a younger woman, what would they do?
Okay, well, I think in the church, this is a very important topic, and this is one of the things I kind of touch on in my women's ministry classes too. So there's a little bit, if we're looking at older women in the church versus the teenagers, there's a little bit of a gap here in communication that needs to be considered. And so a lot of older women that I've met, they are afraid to butt into the lives of the younger women. They don't want to pry. That's how they've been raised. They don't want to overstep their boundaries. And the younger women really want an older woman to approach them and to talk with them. And so I think the first thing is just to realize that these girls are craving this. There are not enough people out there who are pouring into them, and they're craving this. They want people to sit down and talk with them. And so if they're invited to coffee or something like that, I mean, that's going to be time that they value. Yeah. And I have noticed as well, just in town, we've got one of our local churches that has organized younger couples. I think it's mainly younger couples with young kids, and they've got them in core groups, and so they meet. And many times they meet at 6:30 in the morning. Now, from everything I understand about teenagers, they don't typically want to be someplace at 6:30 in the morning. But
nor do I. Yeah.
And these teens, they don't complain. They're there, and these families are also there. These couples are there pouring into them, and they're very open to it. So that just kind of shows you how much they want to have these conversations. So I would just say keep your eyes open and be looking, for opportunities to do this, and just to invite them to come do things with you, just little things, even if it's just something that's interpersonal, or if you're planning something. We often invite a student to come alongside us when we're planning a big event, because it's easier to do it yourself if you've seen it done before. Right. And so that's always something that we're looking out for. So,
yeah, fascinating. So I'm thinking about how profound that could be, to always be trying, when we have something big, to be reaching to a younger person and say, why don't you come help me plan this, or come along with me while I do this.
Yeah. Their lives might get busy. Sometimes they stick with it. Sometimes they don't. But you just keep inviting the ones that look like they might be interested in it. And so but yeah, I think it's very helpful. But
You know, in my experience, a lot of people show a hesitancy about trying to do mentoring or leading. And of course, as we've been talking about, I think sometimes the problem there is obviously they haven't had any role models of their own to look at for how to do this. But I've had a lot of people who've been quick to kind of defer to the professionals, so to speak. Well, Mark, I don't have all the education you have, so you should really just kind of do this. Or people can kind of lean on you because they'll say, well, what do I know? And what I hear you saying is that it's really not a matter of being an expert. It's really just a matter of being available, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Being available and being willing to share. And so I think my favorite image of what a mentor does is it's kind of like a coat rack. And you go and you hang your different jackets and coats on the coat rack. And then as you're sitting there, you make those available. You're willing to take something down, talk about it, look at it. And one of the big things with mentoring is listening too. And so I think what intimidates a lot of people is just the idea that we have to have all the answers. But I mean, think about it for a minute. Is the world really like that? Do we have all the answers to all the issues? No. And so a little bit of humility, I mean, that goes a long way. What younger people really respect is people who are authentic and being able to say, this is a really hard topic and I don't really know what to do with this. I struggle with this sometimes myself too. That can be very reassuring to somebody that's trying to work through something. So we don't have to have all the answers. It's just important to jump in there and be willing to engage in those conversations and spend time with them. So
yeah, that's kind of a fundamental thing about counseling skills, isn't it? That you don't go in needing to solve anyone's problems. You just need to be a listening presence. And if it really is a matter of problem solving, how often people can solve their own problems by just having space to kind of talk through them and think through them. But on that other level, as you say, the emotional empathy of just, I don't understand it either. I can't solve it either, but I'm here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. That's profound. So other aspects of your research that you'd want to highlight, things maybe we hadn't touched on yet that you've been thinking about?
Okay. So here's something that I thought was interesting, and we're still looking at pre-college experiences here. But for example, so when I look to see percentage-wise who or what went in and kind of contributed to the lives of our male students. So the question was, what best helped you recognize the need for spiritual growth before college? And for the male students, so they ranked higher: friends, peers, role models, mentors, leadership opportunities, and family. And for women, they ranked higher than the male students: local church and outreach opportunities. So again, we're seeing that they really value the local church, but outreach, that's another area where there's a lot of work to be done, and it's just almost unlimited, and women do find it easier to get involved with some of that stuff. So the other big thing that I think is really important is how to teach women. Okay. So the way that they learn and the way that they appreciate things is a little bit different. So, and again, the world is changing to where we're more concrete, we're more experiential, but women do have a tendency to learn better in that way. So in a way that's a little bit more hands-on. And so one example might be incorporating more character studies into lessons or into sermons. So that might be something that's helpful. And then also, the question, what most encourages spiritual growth when studying the Bible in the classroom? So men set at a rate of 38.2% that theological discussion helps them. And so that's something we like to do. We like to have those big, deep discussions. Women set it at a rate of 27.8%. So when I asked what most discourages spiritual growth when studying the Bible in the classroom, 27.2% of women chose theological discussions as the most discouraging thing. So that was almost equal. And so basically, I think what we need to take from that, should we have deep theological discussions? Yes. Okay, so that's an important thing that is going to help over a fourth of our females grow best. But at the same time, almost the same number of women are having a negative reaction to it. And it just makes me want to ask follow-up questions, because students and the comments that they make also seem to be very discouraging to both genders. But I do wonder if perhaps some of the arguing or the dissension, that might be the reason that some of the women didn't like that. But just knowing that the women in the class, over half of them are responding very positively. Not over half, I'm sorry, over half of them are having a very strong response to it. And of that, about 55%, half of them are responding positively and half negatively. So just being aware of something like that. So
yeah, so I'm thinking about that, and it's making me think about tasks like preaching and teaching. How do we do a better job? So one of the things you said a minute ago was about kind of going deeper with character studies. So
right.
what I'm kind of picturing in my head, feel free to talk about this. What I'm kind of thinking about is, there's kind of the analytical way to go about character study, which is where you say Paul lived from AD this to this, or BC this to AD this, and he lived in this location and did this and did this. But another way that we can try to get into character studies in the Bible is to look at specific circumstances and try to put ourselves in the emotional space of what that person was experiencing. And I know, I think the Psalms lend themselves very well to that kind of thing. I like to read the Psalms and try to put myself in the place of, what would a person have to be going through to think these thoughts and say these words? But it seems to me I'm trying to brainstorm on how to do this better, but it seems to me like allowing space to explore the Bible stories emotionally, not just historical critically. Does that make sense? Is that a helpful thing?
It makes sense. Yeah, and it's beyond emotional too. It's more relational.
Yeah.
And it's just the ability to understand what's going on. As far as the Psalms are concerned, anytime we can get people to read the scripture, especially those that grew up hearing the scripture their whole lives. So anytime we can get them to read scripture in a way that's fresh and new, and it's great to be analytical sometimes, but they've got to be able to be reflective. And so from a spiritual growth standpoint, that's also very important, that they have a chance to know how to use the text to grow spiritually.
So to make sure everyone's clear on what you're saying, so when you're talking about analytical, what I understand, you're talking more about just analyzing what's there. When you say reflective, you're talking more about what does this do to me? What does this mean for me?
What does this do to me? What would I be like if I was in this situation? What would make me want to write this psalm? So we do need to have both. We can't have all of one, end of that all the time. But I do think we have a term called over-familiarity, and I don't want to toss that around too much, because I think there are fewer and fewer students who are over-familiar with the Bible.
Yeah.
I think there's a great need for biblical literacy in general, just because of our approach to teen studies. We kind of give this nice little package, but it's not too deep, and that's another area we can talk about too. But if somebody is over familiar, then they definitely need to have a chance to engage with scripture in a new way that is geared more towards spiritual growth.
Yeah.
So
have you adopted any, I know you're teaching several classes at Harding. Has there been anything about your own approach that you've done to try and embody that? Could you talk about something you might typically do in one of your classes and how you work it from that angle?
Well, one of the things I try to do, and the classroom is kind of an interesting animal, because I do have a certain amount of material that I have to teach in a semester. And so I teach New Testament survey, and that goes over the entire freshman year, and Old Testament survey, which also goes over the entire sophomore year. So I work through the whole Bible, teach the whole Bible through every year. But so I do have to do quite a bit of background, but the way I approach it, I want them to be able to imagine and understand the situation, because I want to give them the tools to be able to figure out what's happening, how to interpret the text. And so I do present that, but I present it with that end goal in mind. But I try to take time to look at individual people. Now, when I'm speaking in a church, then I have a better chance to do that. So I can really flesh that out. I do provide background. I do provide information that is needed for them to understand it. But we can focus in a little bit more as a character study. But I have tried to do that as much as possible in the classroom too.
Anessa, I know one of your areas of study has to do with spiritual examples for people before they get to college. So why don't you talk a little more about your research in that area?
Yes, that was very interesting. This was one of the few questions where I really expected to see a certain example.
Hmm.
And so Dr. Glanville, who did her research out at Fuller or through Fuller, so she was looking at the importance of same gender spiritual examples. And so what she found, which I don't think comes as a big shock or anything, is that men grow best from a male spiritual example and women grow best from a female spiritual example. And just to give you an example, so she would have expected to see, or I would have expected to see these to be in like the 80s or 90s percentages. Okay, so it should have been a very strong affinity towards a same gender spiritual example. But from my population, and so my population, the one that I use for my research for my dissertation, I just pulled out the Church of Christ students.
Mhm.
And so, but 83.3% of male students said that they learned the most from a male spiritual example before college,
Mhm.
and 51.1% of women said from a male spiritual example. No, I'm sorry. 51.1% of women said female spiritual example, and 42.9% said male.
Mm.
So those percentages were completely different. So
Mhm.
her research had been replicated by other people. So I'd run into one or two other places where somebody had done it, and it stood true that there is an affinity for same gender examples.
Yes.
But why is the Church of Christ so different?
Mm.
So, and I really, this is one of those areas where I'd love to ask a lot of follow-up questions on that. I mean, is it that this is just another symptom of the problem I mentioned, that women are not being poured into and developed? Or is it that they're not seeing examples?
Yeah.
And some of this could have to do with the way we talk. We kind of get into this churchese, we talk about things in a certain way. And so in the Church of Christ, we really emphasize male spiritual leadership.
Mhm.
And we talk about that, and that's synonymous with male elders or, something along that lines.
Mhm.
However, I mean, just think about it for a minute. So do we ever grow spiritually by watching women?
Mm.
So what about a woman who is really deeply caring for her dying husband?
Yeah.
Or who is dealing with a situation with a child that's very difficult?
Mhm.
And so do we ever learn spiritually just by watching somebody else? And I'm using those examples because even in a very conservative context, I think we could say that, yes, we are challenged spiritually by watching the lives of women and watching what they do. And so I think that's something we kind of need to consider, because if we're
Yeah.
never saying that we can grow or we can learn from our interactions with women, then that's actually kind of showing the girls that there aren't female spiritual examples.
Wow.
And so it's kind of a language issue, I think. And I do think that's something we need to consider.
Yeah.
So,
You're making me think about greater space for telling our own stories.
Yeah.
In churches of Christ, I know some of the
helpful.
traditional preaching models have been very much, 3 points in a prayer, but book, chapter, verse, book, chapter, verse, book, chapter, verse, and things are always kind of presented in that way. And I know to some
Mhm.
extent we've shown some aversion to things we would call testimony or something, but
Yeah.
but there really, it sounds to me like, is a healthy need for telling our own stories and reminding ourselves that God has not only been active, 2,000 years ago, but that God is still
Mhm.
active, still working through people, and still giving us examples of faith that surround us.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And just so that even the girls know who they can learn from.
Right. Right.
So knowing who's in the church that has a story that
Yeah.
they, might want to gravitate towards. So very important
Yeah.
and very surprising. Yeah, I found it to be disturbing. So
Yeah. That's a hard thing to hear.
it
For
really
sure.
is. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you also had some further work as it pertains to what you can do in the classroom.
Yes.
So yeah, what would you say could be different in a classroom in particular?
Well, I think we're pretty familiar with the idea of different learning styles.
Yes.
So that's something that's familiar. Even preachers, they often consider how people will react to a sermon. So how could somebody hear this? But I think we need to take the concept of gender, and also apply it onto this. So how would a woman hear this? And there are definitely certain things that, not related to my research, but just my ministry in general, that women will react to in certain ways.
Okay.
And so how are they going to hear that?
Mm-hmm.
How are they going to react to it?
Mm-hmm.
Am I presenting something in a way where this could cause them to doubt something? Like, for example, women will be saved through childbearing.
Mm-hmm.
I've done some work on that, and I know we're not discussing that today, but just
Mm-hmm.
as an example. So how are women in the audience who are unmarried going to hear something like that? How are women, especially women who are having a difficult time having children,
Right.
how are they going to react towards that? And I know that something like that is a real area of concern. So just kind of considering from a gender perspective, how are women going to react to this? And am I giving a balanced view of things? Like, for example, am I giving a balanced view of marriage?
Mm.
So I'm always listening when we're talking about marriage, and especially in a church setting. So are we only going to focus in on what the wives should do, or are we looking at both genders? So
Yeah.
I think just creating that balance, realizing that people are listening, are watching. And so I think that needs to be considered. So balancing. So knowing that women are going to learn a little bit differently, a little bit more experiential.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a tendency to gravitate towards text more. So they get a lot out of the text.
Yeah.
So just those character studies and just kind of taking that into account, I think would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about some of the differences between men and women, I'm thinking about, how do I do a better job of even picturing how it is that a woman would receive this or that I'm talking about. So I guess an obvious go-to for preachers, teachers in any context is to talk to your spouse of the other gender and say, hey, here's what I'm working on. How do you hear this? How do you read this passage? What do you see? What would be helpful to you? But I think there's probably also some spaces where things can get awkward, where people might, even with good intentions, might say things in a way that's really clumsy. What would be some things that we should be careful about in how we talk to each other?
Right. Well, I think it's important to consider, and this is definitely a big issue that I deal with on a regular basis with what I do, and especially with students. So let's say, for example, that there's a conversation about women's role. Okay. So this could happen as we're come across something in the text, and then there's some very opinionated student, and they present something or present ideas in a way that isn't loving.
Mm-hmm.
And so the female students in the classroom, they may not react to it.
Mm-hmm.
You may not see that there's any sort of effect, but it is affecting them.
Yes.
And so that's something to consider. And that's not even the teacher's doing per se.
Mm-hmm.
It could be somebody else in the classroom doing, and the way that it's presented, somebody that's very unrefined in their approach, but it does have an effect. And so I think it's really important to keep lines of communication open. And it's also, when that happens, I mean, that's just from a teacher's perspective, I know that's awkward. You don't want to start an argument in the classroom, but if the women in the class don't see the person who's teaching engage and either disarm or strongly affirm women, in the face of whatever's been said, then that's really going to affect their view of the teacher, but it also could affect them spiritually. They may not feel safe in that space. And so I think that's something that we've got to consider, that everything we're talking about has a spiritual effect on women. And that's a long-term effect. And we're losing, honestly, the Church of Christ is losing some very talented women because they haven't been able to navigate the waters. The waters have been rough enough that it was affecting them spiritually, and they had to, make a decision. Am I going to stick with this, or am I going to go someplace else? And for some of them, that's been the better choice for them. That is how they presented that to me. So that's something we need to think about, because we want to hang on to people. We need to be able to maintain some of our very talented women and help them find places to serve and help them find a way to use their gifts. And so let's take, for example, and sadly, this is a story that's repeated more often than we would like. So you have a woman that's growing spiritually, and she understands that she has to be able to use her gifts. Like that is part of her responsibility.
Right.
She's reading the Bible, she's learning, she's growing, she understands that. And then she can't figure out how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So then she's aware that she is not being faithful with her gifts. What's she going to do?
Right.
That puts her in a very difficult position. And so she feels like she can't be the faithful Christian that she's been called to be. That has a huge spiritual effect.
Yeah.
Other things have to do with hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
So if women are not allowed to, especially in areas where they aren't allowed to contribute into, what's going on in church that much, when they see people who they know, and women typically know who is living a double life,
right,
they're up front and they're leading the worship service. So that has a big effect.
Yeah. Something that happened a few years ago for me, I think, Sarah Barton.
Yes.
I was in a class at Lipscomb with Sarah, and of course Sarah is a person who kind of fits what you were describing, where she has a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of gifts for teaching and speaking, and has struggled to kind of find a place to use those, and very much feels called to do that. But I was grumbling about, at the church I was at the time, we had a very traditional Wednesday night format where everybody starts off in the auditorium, and my job as the youth minister was to give the 3 to 7 minute devotional talk that was clearly, I shouldn't be too disparaging, but it felt to me like kind of a throwaway talk. Like I didn't want to do anything really good, because you ought to save that for a full sermon. And so I appreciated but also kind of resented that space of, every week I've got to present this when I know full well probably no one's going to respond to the invitation. And I was grumbling about kind of the burden of always having to come up with these 5 to 7 minute devotional talks that to me felt like I was just taking really good ideas and kind of tossing them to the side. And I remember she said, she looked at me really intently and said, Mark, I would give absolutely anything to be able to get to speak at a church for 5 to 7 minutes a week. I would give anything to have an opportunity like that. And, that hit me pretty hard. And that's something that's continued to work on me, is for those of us who are in positions of leadership, most often males, it's so easy when you're the one with power and influence to just brush aside the needs of those who don't have the same opportunities as you. And I know I've been trying to work on being a lot more mindful and inclusive of our ladies and how they're feeling and what their needs are. And some of the questions you're raising, I think we've got to keep wrestling with. How are we going to create spaces where we're training women up to lead and be important and to make a difference and to use their gifts, but not to just train them up for nothing. We've got to have some place for them to land and for them to serve. So this is a really convicting conversation.
And again, you may look at the audience and not pick up on what they're feeling.
Right.
So there definitely needs to be conversations. They get into a mode where they're expected to be silent.
Yeah.
And so they're not going to share their convictions. What's really interesting is, especially if there's been a somewhat animated or in-depth conversation about women's roles. I remember one that happened at our church in Bible class, and only the men were responding.
Yeah.
So only the men were contributing to the conversation.
Yeah.
I found that to be not surprising, but very intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after it was over, there were so many women that came up to me, women that I didn't even know were thinking about this, and were coming up and saying their thoughts and opinions about it afterwards. But it's almost like they become trained to not contribute to that. But it has a huge effect. Yeah. So they need to have a space and have a chance to make an impact on local churches too, however that's done. So, but yeah.
Well, Anessa, thank you. This is a really important conversation, and I'll be curious. I know you're busy with your teaching load there and speaking opportunities and things that you get, but anytime you have further thoughts on this, if you're able to do any more research, always happy to have you back to talk with you a little more. Really appreciate
love to be back and share with you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Yeah. All right, thanks.